Welcome back. Continuing along with the HIA process, the next step I'm going to introduce you to is reporting. And this is the time in the HIA process where we disseminate the report to the public and stakeholders, and we also solicit input. Essentially, during this step, the HIA team, with the involvement of stakeholders, disseminates information, including the HIA's purpose, process, findings, and recommendations to a wide range of stakeholders. The reporting step basically involves two things. One, actually developing the report, and two, communicating findings and recommendations. And I'll cover both. When it's time to develop the report, there are a few things I think are really important to include. One, who are the contributors to the report? Who actually did the assessment? Who were involved? Where did funding come from? How were the processes for each HIA step approached? How did the team approach each of the steps? And how were the data collected, for example? What happened in the assessment? Transparency is so important here. I will say that I've been involved in HIAs where we've had members of an advisory group, and we asked them if we can list them in our report before doing so. And we've had a few times, or I've been involved in HIAs where a few times people don't want to be listed. And so we have to respect that. And ultimately, though, we want to include everybody who is part of the process in the report as part of transparency. The report should be readily accessible for public review and comment. This, I think happens most often by putting it on a website somewhere. But I think the question then is, well, how many people are actually accessing that website and who are actually going to look at the report? Reporting also includes the communicating the findings and those recommendations. And we might see that done through a newsletter or some formal presentation. I've seen testimony at hearings or a fact sheet. But one of the things that we've learned is that, good communication throughout the HIA process is a really great way to engage stakeholders. And we found that having good reporting and communication is one facilitator of greater acceptance of the HIA findings and recommendations. There are some key issues that come up for reporting. Again, the first one is transparency and this question about, is the report public? Can people find it online? I think related to that as well is, how is the report written? What's the education level that the report's written at? Is it way too technical that nobody's going to actually understand it if they can even get it and find it? But we want to be transparent. We want the report written in a way that's clear and that anybody can sort of pick it up. One of the things that we've done is to have a brief overview or an executive summary, followed by some very technical appendices for individuals who want to really dig down into some aspects of the data. But writing the report for us is really important, and by us, I'm referring to colleagues I work with who do HIA, including those at the Health Impact Project. But what we want to do is to make sure that our report is clearly written for the end users, and that we are transparent with where you can find it and that people can publicly get to it. A related point is around dissemination. Again, how do we ensure that the stakeholders are aware of the report and can actually view it? I just mentioned accessibility. Another part is the language. I've seen HIAs before that have engaged a predominantly Hispanic population, for example, and they've actually done a great job of translating that HIA and the dissemination materials into Spanish. And I don't see that often because of lack of resources, but I think it's something really important to consider. So if an HIA is done around an issue that might affect a population that doesn't speak English, I think it's critical to think about, how do we share those findings with members of that community? And therefore, you have to really include resources around translation. If the group that you're targeting does not speak English, it doesn't help to just share those findings with that group in English. Another issue to think about is sort of responses to public input. And the question here is, will there be an opportunity for the public to comment on the draft? And if so, how will responses be made to those comments? I've been involved with HIAs where we sent our whole report out to all the stakeholders we engaged, and some sent us back line by line edits and comments. And ultimately, it's our responsibility as HIA practitioners to respond to every one of those comments. We ended up sharing those responses back with the stakeholders to let them know what we changed and what we didn't and why not. We didn't publish those responses on the website, but we did share with them how the report changed and ultimately put the final report up on the website. So I think the best way people are sort of doing this in terms of responses to public input is through stakeholder engagement. So the second part of reporting that I mentioned was sort of actually sharing and disseminating or communicating your findings. And up here is a list that is not totally exhaustive, but this includes the ways that I've seen HIA findings be shared widely with various stakeholders. So again, I mentioned executive summary, and we see that often. People don't often read the whole report. We just, we're in the process of preparing to release an HIA very soon, and we have a very short overview followed by the longer report, and we expect people are going to read the short overview. And some may dig deeper into the full report, but we will be pushing out the executive summary pretty hard. We've also seen individuals have public or one-on-one meetings to share with stakeholders and the community findings from the HIA. We've seen fact sheets get developed that highlight in a very brief way what the HIA found, why it was done, and the recommendations. We've seen testimony at hearings, particularly if an HIA is around a proposed bill. The HIA team and our stakeholders might go testify and talk about what was learned from that HIA. One of the very first HIAs that I worked on was about a bill through the Maryland legislature, and a student who worked with me went and testified and shared our HIA findings at that bill hearing. We've seen press conferences done a great way to generate support and interest from the media around a topic. We've also seen HIA teams write op-eds and highlight the HIA in the op-ed. We've seen websites and blogs and, of course, use of social media to help push out HIA reports, particularly on Twitter. We've seen a lot of action there. Press releases and also radio interviews. I think the best thing for me to highlight around disseminating your findings is to utilize the strategies that will get to your audiences. So if you think back to the scoping step that we talked about earlier, one of the things I mentioned was to start to outline your dissemination plan and your stakeholders. So if there are particular groups of stakeholders that are best reached through social media, then that's going to be part of your communication strategy. If getting to policymakers is part of your group that you want to engage with, then perhaps writing testimony and scheduling one-on-one meetings or going to do a briefing are the best strategies. Regardless of what you use, I have found you're going to use a number of strategies, and as you think through them, you want to make sure that those strategies align with you getting to the individuals who need to know about this HIA and who need to know about what you found and how do we address health in the recommendations and future implementation. So that's just a brief overview of HIA reporting. Again, strategies that I outlined are very similar to things I'm sure you use in your day-to-day work and communicating your research findings, for example. And I want to just highlight again how important transparency is. I encourage you to read HIA reports. I mentioned the Health Impact Project earlier, and if you take a look at reports that are available through their website, you'll see how people go about presenting their data, how they describe who was involved, how they engage stakeholders. And I think this is a really great way for you to figure out some strategies that you might use if you decide to conduct an HIA in the future. So we're going to wrap this part of this module up and turn to our next module in this process, which is on monitoring and evaluation. Thank you.